Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 1st of February 2025. I am going to talk predominantly about Donald Trump and the US with regard to these negotiations that are being discussed and the future of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. Because while I've been away in Ukraine for sort of 10, 11 days, 12 days, however long it's been, there's an awful lot has happened. In fact, some of these will date back to that time period. We're going to go through some of the rhetoric that's been talked about and try and unpick what's going on. You know my views on Donald Trump. I'm not a fan of him morally as an individual, but actually as an international politician, I think he's actually just being a bit of a bully at the moment. We're going to talk about that because it's important. It's important to understand what's going on with Trump because what the US do with regard to not only Ukraine but also its allies is going to be incredibly important for how the world evolves, really, politically speaking, in the next however long. And yeah, I don't want this to just be like an excuse to trash Trump. We need to understand what's going on because um, Ukraine's future hangs in a balance, but also the special relationship, say, between the UK and the US, the relationship with the US to Europe, to Canada, to Mexico. I think we're in an incredibly volatile time at the moment, and Trump is doing America first. He's doing America first, but unfortunately, the first casualties uh, to in this new political approach are going to be the allies to the US. It's not a case of like we're going to isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. It's like we are going to cut off our relationships with those countries that would otherwise be our allies. And we're not really going to have the guts to go after, and we don't quite know why, but countries like China, much more formally, it's like we have reversed the TikTok decision. We have not done this. We're not doing that. But what we are going to do is threaten Denmark with Greenland. We are going to threaten Panama. We are going to threaten Colombia. We are going to threaten Canada. We are going to threaten Mexico. We are going to threaten the EU. So now there are, and we are going to threaten Taiwan. So all these tariffs that are going to be laid on all of those nations I've just stated, and also all this other pressure, then you can't help but thinking that Donald Trump is just a big playground bully that's picking on what he thinks is the weak, easy wins, i.e., your mates, because they're not going to push back as much. And he's leaving Russia, at least at the moment, somewhat alone, and he's leaving China largely alone, picking on Taiwan rather than China. Just incredible. And we're going to start with some Brian Ivers. Now, Brian Ivers is an absolutely magnificent supporter of the channel. He's not a massive fan of Donald Trump, but he is a pretty strong Republican. And this is the kind of approach of I think the US will support Ukraine. I think Trump will come good. I'm not a fan of him, but it will work out. So this is probably a good introductory route into this video. So he says the main weapons for Ukraine relative to US policy are Scott Bessent, Keith Kellogg, and Marco Rubio. So these are the Treasury, Special Envoy to Russia and Ukraine, and Bessent is commerce, isn't he? Oh no, he's Treasury, and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of Treasury, here we go, is uniquely qualified to wield power of economic sanctions on Russia. This is true. Absolutely agree with this, and this is why I said the biggest thing for the US with the new administration coming in is not to take the foot off the sanctions on Russia, not to take the foot off Russia's economic neck. So Brian Ivey here is confident that this will continue. He's well connected in the world economic, financial, and to legal levers that make him ideal to tighten the economic noose around Russia and punish those countries and entities that violate sanctions. I agree. If this is what happens, if the US does continue to do that, he's uniquely competent. Kellogg is a Russian skeptic, very clear-eyed about Russian intentions. He won't allow Ukraine to be pushed into the corner. I hope this is true as well. So this is all potentially correct, but it depends whether this actually happens, right? Rubio is similar to Kellogg. I I have some major doubts with regard to Rubio, and we'll come to that in a second. I'm not worried about Pete Hegseth. He's a new DOD. In charge of the Department of Defense Secretary. His entire focus is on China and forcing the military to evolve into a force that can fight and sustain a war in the Pacific. Hegseth will not focus or be concerned about Ukraine. He'll just follow whatever doctrine and the administration adopts towards Ukraine. All in all, the players in the administration are lining up in a way that's encouraging for Ukraine. As I very pithily said, I think that is correct in that they are the good ones, but Trump's rhetoric and everybody else are a concern. So it's not okay. So that's looking on a positive side, but actually, when we listen to some of Trump's rhetoric again, and we're going to come on to this, it's not looking good for Ukraine. And when we look at some of those Trump adjacent people, Tucker Carlson and others, even Lex Friedman now, we are seeing the same old annoying rhetoric. Brian continues in another post, more on the path of the US on Ukraine. Mentioned previously, my conclusion is the US policy was on a collision course with Russia, with all the dangers that entails. Now, a bit on Trump. You all know I intensely dislike the man, but we had to be clear eyed in our analysis of the man. Trump, more than anyone, signals base intent. Agree or disagree, he is unfiltered. Well, yes. There's a reason he dressed in Ukrainian colors when he met with Zelensky. He specifically told Zelensky he would not be shut out. I would consider Trump in this light. If anything, he is adaptable, showing an ability to shift his view, political signals, communication, and resources to align with reality. Um, I somewhat agree with this. I think Trump changes an awful lot because I think he has a proximity bias. So actually, he changes based on what the last person spoke to him said. And I think this is a problem because actually he doesn't really hold enough knowledge and ideology in his head with regard to global geopolitics or really anything, such that he will keep that position, fight for that position because he really believes in it. So I wrote an article on his approaches to abortion back in 2016, I think it was, and he had something like 5 different views on abortion prior to being elected, and that's because he would just say whatever people want him to say in order to get power. And if you understand Trump to be like that, then the point is he doesn't have Ukraine's best interests. If I was going to be the US president, right, I would be fighting for what I thought was good and right, and I would be fighting for Ukraine. And if I had people naysaying this or saying that, I wouldn't just be, oh no, actually I believe that. Or actually I believe that because I really want power and I want you guys to. I disagree with you so I can use you. I'd be like, no, 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 no. What we need to do needs to be for the benefit of both Ukraine and the US, because I think those strategies are aligned, and I can give you all the reasons why that is, and blah blah blah, because I'm knowledgeable enough now on these events and this part of the world and the US to understand the importance of Ukraine to the US and to its strategies. I don't think I don't think Trump has that, and so he will flip flop, and he might well. Um, be adaptable, showing an ability to shift his view, political signals, and communication, and resources to align with the reality. I'd say to align with whoever's speaking to him, and sometimes that is reality, and sometimes it's not reality. And we've seen that, and he has flip flopped on Ukraine. He said all sorts of things on Ukraine, and you're kind of you're trying to guess what he really believes. The problem is, I don't think he really believes anything. And that makes him incredibly dangerous because he can be manipulated. And if he's talking to Keith Kellogg and some of the more clear-eyed analysts and experts, then he might have a good view at that point. But if he's not and he's talking to other people, then he veers into, unfortunately, really bad territory. Brian continues, only one other man in US history has been able to manufacture a comeback after losing a second consecutive term. I mean, I don't think it's because Trump is amazing. I think it's because he had Elon Musk and so on and so forth. We can go into that, but it was somewhat closer than we might think. That is a wide but narrow victory, and you only have to look at the House of Representatives to understand that he's on a knife edge. And yeah, so I wouldn't go too much on that. He will also never engage in conflict from a position of weakness. In every instance of political debate and conflict, he escalates until his opponent is diminished, beaten, or alternatively, he pushes so hard it damages him or makes him look stubborn and foolish. The US will support Ukraine. The problem is he's doing that with his allies rather than with his enemies. And he wants the allies to kowtow to him because I think he's just a basically a dictator, wannabe. Trump just wants to be the kingpin and the big dictator. He doesn't want what's best for the world. He wants what's best for him and that feeling of power, and so on and so forth. Brian has also said, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the path of US policy on Ukraine. You will find that Trump will do what he always does, which is ironically the standard tactics of Russian diplomacy. And this is important. So he's right. Brian is right here. I don't see Trump's behavior any differently to Putin's behavior at the moment. He's just a big bully. He will aggressively escalate US policy against Russia in favor of Ukraine. At the same time, he will signal a wish for negotiations. My only interest is for Ukraine. I could care less about his personality flaws or his ignorance, as you put it. And to a degree, I agree with that. To a degree, I agree with that. Right? If he comes to support Ukraine for the wrong reasons, whatever, as long as he supports Ukraine. And so, yeah, I get that. I just don't think. I think he may sort of support Ukraine, but actually, in areas where it really matters, he probably doesn't have Ukraine's best interests at heart, and that means that we might end up getting a peace, but not a just and sustainable peace. And that is a real worry I have. Trump's confrontational approach will collide with Russia's. This will be more a matter of who blinks first. It could spin out of control, but you must admit the poker hand Trump holds is far better than Putin's. Absolutely agree. So Trump is in such an amazing position to be able to do what would be staggeringly good for Ukraine. I just don't know that I have that much confidence he'll take it. Let's just hope Ukraine doesn't get caught in a cataclysm, and I think that therein we have quite a likely outcome. So let's go through some of these sources then. So US suspends key immigration. So just to give you a sense of what's going on in US politics as well. So we've had the US suspending key immigration programs for Ukraine, Cuba, Haiti, Venezuela. The U4U program that helped 150,000 plus Ukrainians is now on hold. Pentagon sources said Voice of America that Ukraine told Voice of America that Ukrainian program will not be affected, but it looks like it is. So again, it's like why I'm telling you this is the question is always: does he have Ukraine's best interests at heart here? No. Is there an exclusion for Ukraine? No. Don't care. So we get a sense of what Trump believes about Ukraine by the actions that he takes. Ukraine's energy grid may suffer amid the Trump aid freeze. So he's then frozen US aid, for 90 days to Ukraine. And I have been to organizations where I was there the other night to a civic society organization where Jonathan Fink was giving a talk, and 70 to 80% of their funding is from US aid. These organizations are on the precipice at the moment. And again, if you really cared about Ukraine, you would not be doing that. So again, the signs are either from him, because actually he's getting past these executive orders, and he goes, "Oh, that's a big one. Oh, that's a big one." And he doesn't really. I don't think he really knows what he's signing half the time. And then the person that's speaking to him, is it Stephen Miller? I don't know, but sort of talking about, this will end all the woke in the FAA and the woke, and here's woke this, woke that. Everything's about woke and DEI. You can blame a plane crash on DEI, even though you've just fired all the safety personnel from the FAA, and just whatever. Just and you've just got an awful lot of ideology, I think, from people around him. And those people around him who aren't your Keith Kellogg's and your Marco Rubios and so on and so forth, these dangerous people like Stephen Miller, these are the people that are that are manifesting Project 2025 in the form of all these executive orders. And that is, I think, really what the Trump administration is about. And there's going to be this tension between the kind of Keith Kellogg's of the world and the Stephen Millers of the world, and who can speak more sweetly into Trump's ears, who will win that debate. And I do worry that actually Ukraine will be far down the agenda for people like Stephen Miller. That's for sure. Financial Times reported that US diplomats have requested an urgent exemption for Ukraine-related aid programs from a 90-day freeze on foreign aid and stop work orders issued by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. But of course, that hasn't happened. Trump has said, and this is again where you have to concentrate on the words that Trump says when he's slightly unfiltered and he's not on script and he doesn't have a teleprompter. This is, and he's just in a one-to-one. This is what he believes. This is kind of his default position. Zelensky was fighting a much larger entity, much larger, much more powerful. He should not have done that because we could have made a deal. In other words, when Russia invaded Ukraine, Ukraine should have just given up. He should have not fought. Should have not fought that larger entity because we could have made a deal. So as soon as you get invaded, so imagine this, we'll take it to Doris's house again. Doris's house gets invaded by thugs. The first thought is make a deal. Not, actually, let's call the police and get these frickers out of here. This is genuinely what this man believes. And if you are someone that thinks, yeah, Trump is going to be good for Ukraine, he does not believe that Ukraine should be allowed to fight for their own sovereignty. That straight away, a deal should have been struck. That means straight away, you are giving away something without anything else. You just, oh yeah, you can have that. Sorry, please don't come into my house, says Doris. Please don't come into my house. You can have my living room and my garage. Because my neighbour over there, or from across the road actually, he's just said that I should take a deal straight away. So, and that I shouldn't fight you because you're stronger than me. So just have a bunch of stuff, and then I guess maybe in a few months' time you'll just do this again, and then I'll be forced to do a deal with you again where I give away more of my house. And eventually, you've got all my house, and you beat me to a bloody pulp. That's this approach. So all of you like, oh, Trump's amazing. Oh, you didn't understand Trump. No, I perfectly understand Trump. I said months and months and months ago that Trump could do what's right for Ukraine, but it'll only be because either he's convinced by people that know better than him, which is arguably what we're talking about. But I don't know that those people are going to be as strong as the other people who don't want Ukraine to prevail, or you know, or it's by accident, or it's just he helps Ukraine because it's transactionally to his own benefit. That's the most likely outcome. But as I keep saying, and it's clear from what he says, he is not morally aligned with Ukraine. He doesn't have Ukraine's moral interests at heart, and he even doesn't, I don't think, understand Ukraine's strategic importance to the US. He can understand certain transactional elements such as natural resources and hydrocarbons and helping Ukraine if the EU buys more oil and gas from the US. Then he's all in. At the same time, the White House press secretary did not answer the question on how, in Trump's opinion, Ukraine should have responded. That's the freaking point. If you're saying, oh, you know, you shouldn't have fought a much larger entity. Okay, what should they have done? Oh, I can't answer that. Well, I'm really pissed off with people that apologise for Trump. And there's a lot of you out there, and I'm not talking about Brian here. I think that's a much more nuanced case, but there's definitely a lot of Andy S and others on my stream that are like, oh, you don't understand. I understand Trump perfectly well. I don't think you do. You like Ukraine and want to support Ukraine, and you just hope, you just got this wing and a prayer that Trump will be the right guy for it. But you don't understand that Trump doesn't have a moral horse in this race at all, or a geopolitical horse in this race. He's just got a transactional horse in this race, and he may well come up trumps, so to speak. But that will be Ukraine being very lucky. And again, Zelensky is not an angel. He should not have let this war happen. I mean, if I was Zelensky, I'd be struggling not to punch Trump full in the face saying stuff like this. He's fighting a much bigger, this is all part of the same interview, fighting a much bigger country, much bigger, much more powerful. He shouldn't have done it because we could have made a deal. Zelensky wants to make a deal now. He's had enough of it. This is victim blaming, just typical victim blaming. He's not an angel. Why is he not an angel? I want you to substantiate that point. So I'd really be pushing him. I mean, Trump is never given a hard an interview as he should be. He's let off by every freaking interviewer ever. He should just be pressed and pressed and pressed. No, I'm not letting you go on to the next thing. I'm not letting you talk about what you want to talk about. You need to answer this. The only time I've seen him made pretty uncomfortable is the Axios interviewer, Jonathan, what's his name, the Australian guy from Axios. Gave him a really hard time. That's how to interview Trump. Okay, Noel Reports said way back on the 22nd here, so a good 10 days ago. Not in one day, Trump has tasked Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg with ending the Ukraine war in 100 days, a challenge few believe is realistic, especially Russia. Observers see Kellogg's appointment as a first step, with Trump aiming to personally lead peace talks with Putin, and more on that in a second. So it's this idea that, oh, it's more complex than we thought. It's going to take 100 days, and some people thinking, a year or whatever, or within 2025. Trump's national security advisor, Mike Waltz, starts purging the National Security Council, including aides working with Ukraine. So he's getting rid of all the pro-Ukrainian aides. You might think this is part of the course. As anyone comes in, they clear out the offices. But yeah, during a telephone call on January 22nd, NSC employees known as aides or detailees were told that they will leave the office immediately. And you just wonder whether there's going to be any kind of exchanging of knowledge here, or is it just like you're out, you're purged? And I think this is unfortunately the approach of the Trump administration is them bad, us good, get rid of, just purge the crap out of everyone. Edward Hunter Christie said the most recent reporting of how Trump is approaching the Russia-Ukraine war is not entirely negative for supporters of Ukraine. This is notably thanks to rank stupidity and arrogance of the Russian state. This is a really good point here. Moscow just can't help itself. It has to insult and belittle Trump's envoy, and that'll work just great. Ukraine, meanwhile, can credibly say it wants a sensible deal. It's Russia that looks unreasonable at every step, even in the eyes of Trump. So part of how Ukraine could do well out of this, and this is really important for you guys to understand, is that Russia is helping Ukraine by miscalculating it a number of times. So having Melania Trump naked on national TV is an insult to Trump. Now, it could also be saying, it could be a warning shot saying we've got compromat on you, kind of Christopher Steele dossier and so on and so forth, all the dodgy things that have claimed to have taken place in hotels in Moscow. It may not be true. So there may be compromat on Trump, or this is Russia just making stupid error after stupid error. And sometimes you think Russia's this great superpower, but it doesn't understand the US, and it doesn't understand Trump possibly as much as we don't understand Russia quite often. And that makes for potentially a good outcome from Ukraine, that Russia is shooting itself in the foot more often than really it should do. In parallel, uh, Trump's SOS Marco Rubio has placed a pivotal Secretary of State, a pivotal requirement on the table, namely that the war doesn't kick off again after the desired deal. That makes it likely that the new White House will understand the need for Ukraine to be strong enough to deter Russia in the future. So this is the idea that Marco Rubio said, we don't want Russia to come back and have a second bite of the apple, which is exactly what we want to hear. But the only problem is you need NATO membership for that. And the US don't want Ukraine to be in NATO. And if NATO membership is off the table for now, says Hunter Christie, as I was saying, the only way to create future deterrence is to give Ukraine more formidable weapons today and or ensure Ukraine can produce such weapons. In parallel, new sanctions to hit the Russian economy could come into play. If Trump wants to put Russia on a trajectory of mounting costs, he can do so. Meanwhile, Europeans should lead by example and push as hard as they can to aid to Ukraine and on measures against the Russian economy. All of that I agree with. The UK has criticised Trump's promise to quickly end the war, saying it would, and again, this is about 10 days ago, it would give Russia time to rebuild its military per the Times. Senior officials argue full military support for Ukraine is the best path to defeating Russia. Now, like I hinted at you yesterday, the UK is involved in Ukraine in many more ways than all of us realise. I've said right from the beginning, special forces during Ukraine. I mean, that's just a given, as they are in many places around the world. But there are things going on in Ukraine that the UK is behind that are incredibly important in a much more substantial way than the US, like in a tangible way inside Ukraine. And I think that's worth knowing to understand that the UK will not be like, oh, let's give all of that up then just for a quick piece. So there's skin in the game for the UK here, as there will be for Europe, and the US is doing things a little bit more at arm's length, um, but previously helping out to a much larger degree than they are right now, as in with continued military support. That seems to have come to an end now. So it's not looking like Trump's going to give any more military support unless something changes, and unless Russia makes another silly error. so the UK putting pressure on the US here, or at least publicly stating that a quick end to the war is not a good end to the war, is understandable. And it's also really important. It's important that Trump understands this, and I don't think he particularly does. Trump does not rule out imposing new sanctions against Russia if Putin does not sit down to the negotiating table. This is something we've known, but I hope that is a threat that he wields quite freely. Quote, President Zelensky would like peace, but it takes two, Trump added, referring to Putin. Kyiv Independent says the nominee for a US ambassador to the UN, that's Elise Stefanik, says Trump needs maximum flexibility to end the war. Elise Stefanik said during her confirmation hearing that she would use this position at the United Nations to support Trump's strategy and give him maximum flexibility to bring this to a resolution. Good, and I think, yeah, nothing to disagree with there. Now, there was all this hoo-ha about Trump's Truth Social post here, in which he said, "I'm not looking to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people and always had a good relationship with President Putin. And despite the radical left's Russia, Russia, Russia hoax," again, he can't help but, he's just all about grudges, Trump. Just my initial reaction here is freaking grow up, man, and just shut up about that. We need to be thinking about how best to deal with Russia now. We must never forget that Russia helped us win the Second World War, losing almost 60 million lives in the process. And again, like, who is advising Trump? Trump, I mean, it's at the most, Russia lost 26 million. I mean, that's one of the numbers that's touted, but it's a real unknown. It could be many millions either side of that, but not 60 million, right? So it's just like, again, it's just wildly inaccurate what he's saying. And just like, he doesn't do any reading, right? Trump, I mean, literally, he doesn't do any reading. So where's he getting this information from? And somebody needs a slap on the wrist. Anyway, all of that being said, I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse, all caps. If we don't make a deal, and soon, it's all about deals, like, rather than just a deal, rather than a just deal, rather about having fairness, a fair conclusion. If we don't bring this war to a fair conclusion, would be how I would say that. But he says, if we don't make a deal, and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold to Russia, to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which never would have started if I were president, over with. Oh, grow up. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. Which is interesting. No, actually, you might need to do some hard dealing here. He said, we just want you guys to just do the deal easily to begin with. But, is an easy outcome the best outcome? It's time to make a deal. No more lives should be lost, all caps. So lots of people are talking about this. As Tim White says, Russia lost 14 million, he says, in World War II, nowhere near the 60 million mentioned. Ukraine lost 7. So then this gets really interesting. Sorry, this is a really, really important point. So the number I gave you included Belarus, Ukraine, Russian Federation, all these areas of what's now the Russian Federation, and independent nations around there. So actually, did Russia lose 60? Well, no. Russia itself, like, if you understand what Russia is, certainly at that time, lost 7 to 10 million. As a percentage of the population, Ukraine and Belarus both suffered way more than Russia. So the fact he doesn't get that either, and that's stupendously important, is a real freaking insult to Ukraine. Sorry, I can't believe I forgot to mention that. So, yeah, Trump is ignorant. We know Trump is ignorant, and anyone that thinks that he's knowledgeable, when the guy doesn't read any books, like, you don't wake up with knowledge, right? Knowledge comes from hard graft and learning stuff, and he doesn't learn stuff. So if you think he's crazy knowledgeable about international politics, when he was saying, "Hey, Spain is in BRICS, you know what BRICS is," as if like he'd just learnt about BRICS. No, Spain isn't in BRICS. You wing that. So Edward Hunter Christie says Trump's message to Moscow a few hours ago, so this one I just mentioned on True Social sets an interesting tone. After a bit of preamble, he writes, "I'm going to do Russia a big favor, settle now, blah, blah, blah. And soon I have no other choice but to put high levels, etc., etc." my comment, this is a good approach. Putin and other fascist lunatics in Moscow love to get all American daddy talk like this, by which I mean they hate it and are far too arrogant and proud to be seen as bending to a higher authority, which is how Trump presents himself. And that's the reality, of course. America is a higher authority compared to Russia, and Moscow had better do as it's told or face painful consequences. That's the right tone to take. I suggest amplifying that very tone. Anyone reading this, if you have dealings with representatives of the Russian criminal state, talk down to them, make it clear they are expected to obey America's command or face painful consequences. You don't need to be an American to do this, but even better if you're from a small state, remember to point out that Russia is failing and that this can go either the easy way or the hard way. Throw in some finger wagging just to be sure to cross the language barrier. Diplomacy saves lives. So he's like, this is the right way, the right kind of approach. I would disagree with a number of aspects of this, but the point of Trump getting angry with Russia is right. Like this is what Trump needs to do, which is get tough on Russia. Like he's so happy to be the bully boy with Canada and Mexico and Denmark. It's about time he actually did that to the freaking enemies of the world, of the enemies of the US. Landsbergis, a former foreign minister from Lithuania, says Trump put Putin in a tough spot by issuing an ultimatum. I'm not sure this is not the way Putin expected things to work. Now, Putin has to choose, accept that he fears new sanctions because his economy is in a shambles, or prove that his imperialistic ambitions will not be limited to these demands. The ultimatum is a step in the right direction, but we must do more. Not only sanctions, but also military support and security guarantees. And that's the important part. Security guarantees are so important. We must put Western might on the Ukrainian side of the scale. By the way, if it wants to appear credible, the EU could at least announce support for Trump's sanctions. And I trust that now even Orban will have to agree. And that's interesting. So Orban's been caught between a bit of a rock and a hard place in light of at least that statement where he was like, oh, I think we should hold off on EU sanctions until Trump comes in because I think things are going to change. And then Trump comes in and says, and threatens Putin with sanctions like this. And Orban's a bit like, oh, that's uncomfortable. And again, here, War Translated, another one saying, today's rather sharp statement from Trump has been interpreted by Russian radicals not only as an ultimatum, but also as a direct insult. They are convinced that their patron Putin would never agree to any concessions, which in their eyes means Trump is deliberately sabotaging the negotiations. As a result, and he brings up certain claims here from Russians that you can go and read here on the screen. But I'm just going to go through War Translated to Dimitri's analysis. As a result, Russians are furious since they've been unable to achieve a breakthrough on the front lines. Even the full occupation of the four claimed regions remains a distant and uncertain goal, even if it's achievable at all, he says. And there's a few more up here on the screen for you to read. You want to pause the video. Trump didn't bother to outline a plausible scenario for such a deal. Surely he must understand that Putin cannot simply stop the war. His hordes have no alternative but to keep going forward. No one wants them back in Russia. And this is something that's been mentioned a number of times, that actually Russia can't afford to stop the war in many ways. Trump said that Putin didn't make a deal. He would impose higher taxes and sanctions on everything Russia sells to the US and other countries. This war, says Andrzej Duda, the PIS, Law and Justice Party from Poland, pretty right wing government. The former government is now Donald Tusk with the coalition in charge, but the president is still from the PIS party. Said this war cannot end with the victory of the aggressor Russia, the one who is realizing its imperial ambitions. It must be defeated. What else do we have? So the Kremlin responds to Trump's sanctions threats, and depends what deal means, says the Kremlin. Quote, it's not merely the question of ending the war, so we have to see what does a deal mean in President Trump's understanding. And that's Russia's Deputy UN Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky. Kremlin considers Trump's threats, according to Wall Street Journal, empty and believes Moscow can withstand at least another year of conflict. Although Russia is losing money and people, analysts say it has enough of both to continue the war and has the upper hand. So an interesting point of view there. Now, Kyiv Independent has a whole analysis here. Might pop into this a little bit. Pretty decent article. Trump sees peace in Ukraine as a deal, but refuses to play his winning hand. It's from Timothy Ash, who's from the Chatham House think tank in the UK. The impending Donald Trump presidency has fueled market speculation that a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine could be reached soon, bolstered by Trump's campaign trail rhetoric promising to end the war within days of taking office, if not sooner. Ukrainian Eurobonds have been among the best performing assets in emerging markets in recent months, notably alongside Lebanon, another war or peace play. However, achieving a durable peace between Ukraine and Russia may not be as simple as Trump has implied, a realization that seems to have dawned on him. His initial promise of peace within days has now been extended to 6 months. General Keith Kellogg, Trump's designated Ukraine envoy, has also tempered expectations, expressing hope for a breakthrough within the first 100 days of the Trump administration, a timeframe that is likely to slip further. Does Trump actually have a peace plan for Ukraine? Is doubtful. The shifting deadlines for progress reflect this uncertainty. Trump and Kellogg don't appear to have a deep understanding of Ukraine, Putin, or European security. Ukraine's fate doesn't seem to rank high among Trump's priorities. That's my point. It's fate. Like, it's really important. That's a really important statement there that you could easily just wash over. But Trump doesn't care about Ukraine's fate. Trump cares about the US's fate. Ukraine's fate is irrelevant to Trump. If Ukraine ceased to exist and Trump and the US were just about, Trump was all right, then he wouldn't give a toss. Ukraine's fate doesn't seem to rank high among Trump's priorities, which focus instead on making America great again. Campaign promises to pull financial support for Ukraine resonated with voters when framed as reallocating resources to neglected US communities. However, even if US support for Ukraine is cut, it's unlikely those funds will find their way to disadvantaged Rust Belt communities. Absolutely, of course, these are completely different buckets of money. For Trump, Ukraine is a problem for Europe. His recent comments about US territorial ambitions, including Canada, Greenland, and Panama, suggest his intent to extract a quid pro quo from Russian President Putin for signing off on Russian territorial gains in Ukraine. Trump may be signaling that if he accepts Russia's terms, he expects something in return, such as turning a blind eye to US claim on Greenland. The mindset underscores Trump's transactional approach, with Ukraine at risk of being sold out in the process. While Kellogg and Mike Waltz, Trump's pick for national security advisor, might attempt to articulate a coherent strategy, it's unclear if Trump is aligned with their efforts. This is exactly my thinking. Trump holds significant leverage over Putin, particularly regarding Ukraine. Russia needs a deal more than the US does. A prolonged war risks economic collapse from sanctions, potential Yevgeny Prigozhin-style military mutinies, and rising social unrest. While Ukraine also faces challenges, manpower shortages, and donor fatigue, these are manageable compared to the risks for Putin. For the US, the cost of supporting Ukraine is roughly $100 billion over 3 years, 40% from the US. It's a fraction of the defense budget. Much of the spending benefits the US directly through payments for American arms. Often older equipment is being replaced by modern upgrades, and additionally, the war has prompted NATO allies and Ukraine to ramp up the US arms purchases, while Europe is expected to increase defense spending by over $250 billion annually. The longer the war continues, the more the US benefits economically, while Russia's capabilities are depleted, all without risking US troops. I mean, it should be a no-brainer. A more effective negotiating strategy for Trump will be to pressure Putin by threatening increased support for Ukraine or imposing harsher sanctions on Russia's economy. Yes. Steps that would come at minimal cost to the US. Trump could also signal support for Ukraine's NATO membership, which he won't, or approve the use of long-range missiles capable of striking deep into Russia. Maybe. He holds all the leverage. Yet, instead of using this leverage, and here's the point, the Trump administration appears to be giving it away to Putin. Trump has signaled no NATO membership for Ukraine, no long-range missiles, a halt to financial aid for Ukraine, the potential sanctions relief for Russia, and meanwhile, figures like Kellogg and Waltz have floated proposals to freeze front lines, effectively allowing Russia to retain the territory it currently occupies. Despite holding all the aces, Trump seems to have handed the game to Putin. This is my point. For Ukraine, security is paramount to any peace deal. The country can survive losing its territories currently occupied by Russia, but its economic prospects depend on security guarantees. These could come through NATO membership, bilateral security assurances, or robust Western military and financial support akin to the US-Israel relationship. However, Trump's concessions, rejecting NATO membership and dismissing bilateral guarantees, have shifted the debate to limiting Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Putin will exploit this to keep Ukraine vulnerable to a future invasion, deterring investment and stalling reconstruction. The resulting insecurity would discourage millions of Ukrainian refugees from returning home, risking further emigration and domestic instability. Europe faces dire consequences if Ukraine collapses. Waves of Ukrainian refugees fueling far-right populism. And by the way, I've just got a book on populism that Rory. It's one of the Oxford very short introductions, but it's one that Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart were saying this is a good little book to get into on populism. I really do want to do some research on populism. So, but yeah, so waves of Ukrainian refugees fueling far-right populism and a bolstered Russian military-industrial complex, a resurgent Russia emboldened by victory in Ukraine might target the Baltics or Moldova next. Europe's security hinges on Ukraine's ability to defend itself as the front line against Russian aggression. Trump may not grasp the stakes for Europe, but European leaders must. With the US stepping back, Europe must wake up to its existential threat from Russia and take responsibility for Ukraine's defense. A $150 billion annual price tag to support Ukraine is manageable for Europe's $25 trillion economy, especially compared to the $250 to $500 billion yearly increase in defense spending likely required if Ukraine falls. Unlocking the $330 billion in immobilized Russian central bank assets could provide Ukraine with significant funding. There's a lot riding on that. Additionally, Europe should appeal to Trump's economic priorities by framing support for Ukraine as a boon for US jobs, branding it as the Trump plan for the defense of Europe or a modern Marshall Plan. Unfortunately, European leaders remain in denial, ignoring the risks of a Trump presidency and failing to connect the dots between Ukraine's security and their own. Ensuring Ukraine's stability isn't about just protecting one country, it's about safeguarding the future of Europe as a whole. Good stuff there from Timothy Ash. Phillips O'Brien says, just to be clear, amount of new aid that Trump has proposed for Ukraine, zero. The amount of seized Ukrainian territory that Trump has called to be returned to Ukraine, zero. The amount of seized Russian assets that Trump has said should go to Ukraine, zero. The number of specific new sanctions that Trump has called to be placed on Russia, zero. The restrictions on Ukrainian use of US weapons that Trump has lessened, zero. The examples of new weapon systems that Trump has promised to Ukraine, zero. So for all those like people thinking Trump is going to be the bee's knees for Ukraine, he's done the square root of fuck all for Ukraine so far, other than some vague threats on Truth Social to Putin. But tangibly, nothing. So just remember that. Like, he may do the right thing, but isn't really intend to do the right thing for the right reasons, at least. Now, Trump has claimed he urged China's Xi Jinping to help end Russia's war in Ukraine. Quote, he's not done very much on that, Trump told reporters at the White House on the 21st. He's got a lot of power. We like to have a lot of power. Like we have a lot, sorry, Freudian slip there. Like we have a lot of power. I said, you ought to get it settled. We did discuss it. Very kind of rambling Trump there. President Trump said he had asked Saudi Arabia and the OPEC to bring down the cost of oil to force Russia to negotiate. This is a good move, and I expect this. I expect Trump will try and do this, and this is important. Trump's best chance of doing something, but again, he's doing it because it will benefit the US first. So it's a kind of anti-inflationary, and he loves flooding the world with oil. So yesterday he threatened Putin with tariffs and sanctions if he refuses to negotiate. But if he can do that, that'd be good. Now he's had this argument with Fredriksson from the Danish Prime Minister about Greenland. So Shashan Joshi here saying, wonder how the EU anti-coercion mechanisms are going to play in this. A former Danish official added it was a very tough conversation. He threatened specific measures against Denmark, such as targeted tariffs. So apparently he was shouting at Mette Frederiksen on the phone. Now you've had French troops possibly going out to Greenland and other European troops going out to Greenland in the show of support for Denmark. I mean, really? Like, we're at war with Russia, and Trump comes in, gets voted in, and then goes to town on Denmark and all its allies. And it's just insanity, absolute insanity. And as I said to you before, you've got this Danish MEP reacts to Trump by saying, "Mr. Trump, f off," in the European Parliament, and he got reprimanded for it. But I can fully understand why he would say that. And actually, this is a right wing Danish MEP, right? So will otherwise be maybe somewhat aligned to Trump. So there you go. Things have not gone down well in many parts of Europe with Trump coming to power. Republican Andy Ogles has introduced a proposal to amend the constitution. I don't think this will get through, but allowing Trump to serve a third term. So we're just moving on to a little bit here where it's like, are we going to see Trump moving in an authoritarian direction? Is he doing to America what we shout about with regard to Putin and Orban doing to their own countries? Yes, he is. Trump is an authoritarian. There's no doubt about that. He's an autocrat wannabe. He's a dictator wannabe. Trump wants to be a dictator. And if you deny that, you're living in cloud cuckoo land. End of. If you're someone that loves Trump and loves democracy, you've got a problem. So a proposal to amend the constitution to allow him to serve a third term, which is unconstitutional. It's the 14th Amendment, because Trump's leadership is essential to restore America's greatness. Of course it is. I've seen this somewhere before. Anne Applebaum firing independent watch. So Trump has then come out and fired at least 12 independent inspectors general, according to the Washington Post. Actually, he's firing independent watchdogs is straight out of the authoritarian playbook. And she should know. She's written books on it. Read Autocracy Inc. Very good book. Removes another obstacle to corruption and abuse of power. And it's not clear whether it's altogether legal either. And then we've had his matey Elon Musk speaking at the AfD rally, which was all kind of worrying. So you got both Trump and Trump adjacent people seeming to embrace authoritarianism and far right populism. Now, much more recently, so we're going on to the last 24 hours now. So that's all a lot of stuff I had prepped much earlier. It looks like before ending wars, says Gary Kasparov, in faraway lands, Trump has started a war on the US borders. I suppose picking fights with allies is easier than standing up to dictators. This is my big worry. So Chrystia Freeland, who is touted as being the next leader, potentially, she was the finance minister for Justin Trudeau in the Liberal Party. They won't win the election, but she is seen as pretty decent and knows her onions. She said, if Donald Trump slaps 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, we must hit back dollar for dollar, starting with 100% tariffs on all Tesla vehicles and US wine, beer, and spirits. We must protect Canadian workers and businesses. You might start getting like Canada and Mexico palling up with the EU, starting to be more friendly in light of the US going to town on all its allies. This is not going to end well for the US. He came in saying, I'm going to sort out, I'm going to halve your energy bills. I'm going to bring down the cost of stuff. I'm going to lead to deflation, which is never going to happen anyway. Last time that happened was in the Great Depression. So, you don't really want to be advocating for deflation, just keeping a tab on inflation. But instead of doing that, he's going to economic war with all his allies and then saying effectively he's going to invade Greenland. Like, is that going to bring down the cost of stuff? Not really, mate. Trump has announced new trade tariffs against the European Union. Freaking hell, what are you doing, you donut? And import tariffs on semiconductors likely targeting China. To a greater extent, Taiwan. He also stated that the Panama Canal will inevitably come under US control. It's just like, what are you doing, mate? What are you doing?
I'm sure you didn't hear, am I going to impose tariffs on the European Union? You want the truthful answer, or shall we give you a political answer? Absolutely.
Do you want a truthful answer or the political answer? Am I going to impose tariffs on the EU? Absolutely. There you go. Oh, it's just rhetoric. No, he's telling you. And if it's just rhetoric, then he's lying and he's just shitting people up. And that's absolutely unacceptable. It's absolutely unacceptable. This man. People in Denmark now see that the United States is a bigger threat than North Korea and Iran. What is happening in the world if your president of the United States is doing stuff like this to to take otherwise absolutely bona fide cast iron allies of the US, taking them and saying they see the US as a bigger threat than Iran and North Korea. Denmark has until now been one of the most pro-American countries in the world and one of the longest standing allies of the United States, who came out after Article 5 was invoked of the NATO treaty, who came out and supported American troops in Afghanistan. I'll tell you who did: Denmark. It's disgusting. But it looks like the world's most poorly justified "we need it" illegal land claim has hurt relations enormously. Who could have guessed? Just unbelievable. Now, really interesting article here in The Guardian. Trump's revenge agenda has shocked officials who didn't think it was going to be this bad, insiders say. I'm going to read some of this because it's super important to get an understanding. I know this is a long video, but it's going to be super important to understand what direction of travel the US right now has. And it is authoritarian. There is no doubt about this. You have someone who's absolutely hell-bent on revenge against everyone, and that is to the detriment of political stability. So since being restored to the White House on January 20th, the president has gone on a revenge spree against high-profile figures who have previously served him, but earned his enmity by slighting or criticizing him in public. This is basically autocracy 101. He's cancelled Secret Service protection for 3 senior national security officials in his first presidency: John Bolton, former national security advisor; Mike Pompeo, who was CIA director and secretary of state; and Brian Hook, a former assistant secretary of state, even though all are assassination targets on an Iranian government hit list. And there you go, that's Trump. And then he whips up rhetoric against those people. So if the Iranians don't kill him, bloody MAGA people will. The same treatment has been meted out to Anthony Fauci, the infectious diseases expert who angered Trump after joining the White House task force tackling COVID-19 and who also faced death threats. Trump has also fired high-profile figures from government roles on the social media site and stripped 51 former intelligence officials on his social media site, intelligence officials of their security clearances for doubting reports about Hunter Biden's laptop as possible Russian disinformation. We've already had someone gone down for a bit as a Russian agent who was planting that disinformation there, and yet still Trump can't handle that. Yet, whereas Trump's better-known adversaries were possibly expecting a measure of payback, and in some cases, like Fauci's, were pardoned by Joe Biden to shield them from prosecution, more intense vengeance may have been felt by anonymous civil servants who were less prepared. Some senior officials saw the writing on the wall and resigned before his return, but others adopted a hope for the best attitude, only to be shocked by what awaited them, according to insiders. The most common refrain, quote, the most common refrain I'm hearing from people who have left but are still talking to people on the inside is, "I knew it was going to be bad, but I didn't think it was going to be this bad," said Mark Bergman, a veteran Democratic lawyer who's been in contact with some of those who fear that being targets of the retribution campaign reportedly vowed on the campaign trail. Repeatedly vowed. Quote, "There's certainly shell shock. My view is that Trump is animated by his revenge and retribution agenda." End quote. Career officials in the Department of Justice have been summarily fired despite having civil service job protection after being told they cannot be trusted to implement the returning president's agenda. Among those purged are lawyers who were assigned to the investigation of Trump by the former prosecutor Jack Smith, and you can kind of understand that, over his attempts to overturn the 2020 presidential election and his removal of a trove of classified documents from the White House, one of those absolute gimmies of a legal case which should have had Trump invalidated from ever taking the White House again. Also targeted have been about 30 government watchdogs known as inspectors general. So we reported 12 earlier, it's now 30, and responsible for rooting out corruption and wrongdoing. They were dismissed en masse on Friday without the legally required 30-day notice being given to Congress. One possible motivation animating Trump's grievance against the group is that it was an inspector general who initially informed Congress that Trump was improperly pressuring Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden during his last presidency, leading to his first impeachment. It's all freaking connected. About 60 senior officials for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, were put on leave after being accused of trying to circumvent the new administration's order to freeze all aid operations worldwide. Other Trump senior staff, have found themselves switched from their areas of expertise to much less amenable roles after failing to demonstrate an acceptable standard of loyalty to Trump, and so on and so forth. It is basically ominous signs. So last week, in tactics more redolent of totalitarian regimes, the United States has historically been at odds with federal workers were warned of quote adverse consequences if they failed to report their colleagues who refused to comply with the administration's purge of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs or tried to sustain the programs with coded language. It's been described as a roadmap of retribution, these executive orders, one particular one entitled Ending the Weaponization of the Federal Government, so on and so forth. So, and you've got blaming woke and DEI, woke DEI, for the air crash and all this. It's just absolute claptrap. It's pathetic, and it does my nut in. It's so dangerous. And then you get allegations now that Trump's special representative was given $50 million by a Russian oligarch last year. So Trump's special representative, Richard Grenell, has ties to a Russian billionaire. Representative of the newly elected US President Trump, Grenell received $50 million from Russian billionaire Andrei Melnichenko. This is stated in a document which is addressed by Ukrainian intelligence to Ukrainian President Zelensky. And you start making sense of why there's been this rhetoric in Trump-adjacent circles that's been so pro-Russia and anti-Ukraine. The letter says the funds went to Trump's election campaign. In response to this, in June last year, Grenell arranged for Melnichenko to be interviewed by American popular journalist, Tucker Carlson, as a preparation for lifting of international sanctions against the billionaire and his family, as well as against a number of Russian banks. A week after the meeting, an anti-Ukrainian Russian language Telegram channel was created, Tucker Carlson in Russian, which is administered by, Melnichenko's people. It should be noted that Russian oligarch Andrei Melnichenko tops the Russian Forbes list and is in the 58th place in Forbes in the world. His fortune is $25.2 billion. Richard Grenell is now the special representative of the President of the United States and claims to have a high position in the White House. In the so-called peace plan, Grenell believes that the Ukrainian integrity will be preserved, but with autonomies. Absolutely blows my mind. Right, then we hear Shashank Joshi, a bunch of things from him yesterday. Aides to Elon Musk have been charged with running the US government human resources agency have locked career civil servants out of the computer systems. So Elon Musk is now getting involved. The systems include a vast database called Enterprise Human Resources Integration, which contains dates of birth, social security numbers, appraisals, home addresses, pay grades, and lengths of service of government workers, the official said. We have no visibility into what they are doing with the computer and data systems. One of the officials said, this is creating great concern. There is no oversight. It creates real cybersecurity and hacking implications. Just unbelievable. Then we have Trump administration, this is coming from New York Times, plans to examine scores of FBI agents involved in investigations tied to the president and his supporters, setting up a potential purge of the bureau's leaders, as well as rank-and-file agents. The revelation comes a day after Kash Patel, President Trump's nominee to lead the FBI, testified before Congress. And that testifying that he did should have invalidated him. I mean, Kash Patel, he should not be able to be the FBI, in charge of the FBI. And he said he would not carry out a campaign of retribution, but he lied under oath multiple times, Kash Patel. Demonstrably lied under oath. Absolutely terrible. He should be hiked out. Shouldn't get anywhere near that role. One person said FBI agents, says the Washington Post, involved in building cases against rioters on January the 6th, 2021 attack on the Capitol, were also being considered for termination. Then we had the Washington Post report Friday that interim U.S. Attorney for D.C., Ed Martin, has dismissed roughly 30 federal prosecutors who worked on cases against participants in the January the 6th, 2021 riot at the Capitol over the past 4 years. We have, this is Washington Post again, agency CDC staff also sent an email Friday directing them to contact scientific journals to pull back manuscripts that have been accepted but not yet published that did not comply with the executive order on gender ideology. It's all like control, censorship, changing. This is just, there's no freedom of thought here. It's just absolutely incredible situation. I'm really, really worried about the direction of travel for the US. Now, still lots of writing being done, ink being spilled over Trump's aid freeze, the US aid freezing, how the world is reading from Trump's aid freeze. Trump's order to halt most foreign aid has intensified humanitarian crises and raised questions about the United States' reliability as a global leader. Really, really challenging. Then we just heard about Melnichenko, who 50 million to the Trump campaign, then was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. This is Tucker Carlson now.
Saying self-determination is the core idea in democracy. They don't have it in Ukraine because they haven't had an election. They ignored the election because it's run by a dictator called Zelensky. If you wanted to say he's a dictator, that's fine. You support a dictator. The US, your government has supported many dictators, so is mine. That's kind of a fact of life. There are very few democratically elected leaders. Sometimes even our leaders aren't really democratically elected, as you know. I just don't like the moral...
And of course, he was democratically elected, and the Constitution has, under martial law, which the country is, elections should not be held, rather like the UK for, 9 years over World War II, right? But you didn't call... Does he call Winston Churchill a dictator? Because he has to, unless he's got double standards. I hate this man, right? He is an evil human being, and he's compromised by Russia. And... if you're a fan of Trump and Ukraine and Tucker Carlson, we're going to have problems. I don't know if you're a fan of Ukraine, how you can stand by and let this man say what he does and not take him to town. Every human being with a decent ounce of rationality and morality and empathy should be going to town on Tucker Carlson. He's an evil man.
Bullshit that attaches to all of this.
That's fair enough.
Where we tell the population, we're on the side
It's not fair enough, Piers Morgan, you tool.
of democracy, and he's Winston Churchill.
I don't claim it's Mother Teresa against Hitler.
No, but you have, though. You've he's a marvelous person.
I like him. I'm allowed to, aren't I?
I guess you like dictators. You're like, oh, I love that.
So this is horrendous. Piers Morgan should absolutely challenge the crap out of him on that. It's not acceptable.
Zelensky, he's so great.
I do like him.
How can you like a man who's a dictator?
I don't think he's a dictator.
In what sense?
Thank you.
He's not elected. He rules by force. He rules with guns. He kills his opponents. He's assassinated a ton of people. I know someone he tried to assassinate. Fact. Do you feel a little guilty for supporting someone like that?
No, I don't.
Look, I'm just saying.
Anyway, I don't want to get more angry with him than I need to. Trump claims he and Putin should take significant steps to end Russia's war in Ukraine. Quote, "We will be speaking and think we will perhaps do something that'll be significant," Trump told reporters at the Oval Office. "We want to end that war. The war that would not have started if I was president." Same usual rhetoric there. But now, I'm going to, me and Putin can take significant steps to end the war. What about Ukraine? What about Zelensky? So insulting. All of this approach is so insulting. Ukraine doesn't have the agency. You're talking about the country that's been invaded, you plonker. Keith Kellogg, the envoy, says ending the war in Ukraine is in the interest of the whole world, including the US. He emphasized that Washington is considering the possibility of putting pressure on both Russia and Ukraine to start the negotiation process as soon as possible. Let's really pressure the victim here. It's always about pressuring the victim. Yeah, let's pressure the victim. Quote from Keith Kellogg: "Trump knows what he's doing. He knows where to push and where not to push. He'll create leverage for both Ukrainians and Russians. He's a great deal maker. He knows it." Oh, I think some of that is overblown. His ability to make deals. I don't think I don't think there's that much evidence he's good at making deals. US Secretary of State Rubio said that neither Ukraine nor Russia should count on victory in the war. And again, this is what I was talking about earlier, I think in my last video, that Marco Rubio is giving away Ukraine's leverage, kind of like Timothy Ash said in the Kyiv Independent. So he says, according to him, Ukraine will definitely not be able to return the territories occupied by Russia. Russia will also have to sacrifice something and make concessions. Well, that's nice. But it's starting off, the idea that, Ukraine will definitely have to make concessions. Well, you don't say that. You don't, before you go into the art of the deal, it's before you go into a deal, you give away the maximalist position that you want to obtain. But of course, this just tells you that the US is not interested in Ukraine getting its maximal, the optimal out of any deal or negotiation, out of this war. They're not interested in it. They're not interested in Ukraine. Otherwise, you wouldn't say that. I would never say that if I was to be in charge of, facilitating negotiations between two countries. This is so pro-Russian, and that's Marco Rubio, who's supposed to be one of the good. Go back to Brian Ivey, who feels confident that Marco Rubio, Keith Kellogg, and Mike Waltz, they're all Scott Bessent, all in the right people in the right places, and that'll be fine. and then Marco Rubio is just like vomiting up all of the leverage that Ukraine would otherwise have, and just like, oh, just we'll clear that way. They don't need that. Here we have Gitanas Nausėdas, Lithuania's president, in an interview with the Associated Press, warning that a peace settlement without proper deterrence would allow Russia to consolidate its forces and prepare for further military action. Absolutely. So this is sensible stuff, a bit like the British saying a quick peace deal without deterrence in place is completely suboptimal. We don't hear the Americans talk about this. We don't hear Rubio and Trump talk about, well, we want the best for Ukraine. Don't say that. Trump doesn't say that. He doesn't care one iota. Zelensky, though, says the war will end when Ukraine secures a just peace. He emphasized that justice and accountability are essential, says Nell reports, and only when these are guaranteed will the war truly end. He also added that transitioning to diplomatic solutions does not necessarily mean the war is over. Yes, I want to listen more to Zelensky than to people like Tucker Carlson and Donald Trump, who don't appear to know what they're talking about or are so thoroughly compromised as to be deeply problematic. That's enough from my video from me today on this subject. It was a big one because I had this all left over from the last 12 days. My opinion is that Trump might end up doing the right thing, but it will probably be for the wrong reasons, and he's more likely to go strong on a quick and easy ending, which he's kind of said himself. Those are his words. Easy deal rather than hard deal, and that would benefit Russia. It's as simple as that. And I don't have the greatest confidence that Trump is the right person for Ukraine. He might end up being. And I won't eat my words because it's part of my options of what might happen here. He might be the right person for the Ukraine, but for all the wrong reasons. He's not a good human being, Donald Trump. He's not a nice human. He's not empathetic. He doesn't care about the morality here. He doesn't really understand the strategy either, the geopolitical objectives for the United States. He's short-termist and transactional. That's all he cares about. Let's see if we can get some dollars in for US exports of LNG and oil. Let's see if we can get a bunch of rare earth metals out of Ukraine. See if we can screw over Russia for the benefit for the US, which, yeah, fair enough. But there's no kind of longer term, wider thinking. And especially when he's just going and slagging off all the allies and threatening his mates and doing very little against his enemies. I just honestly, the world has gone nuts, and head nut job is Donald Trump. But hey, take care, guys. Speak soon. I'm back.